Welcome to the 37th lecture in this NPTEL course on the 20th century women's novel. In this and the subsequent lecture, I will try my best to wrap up our ongoing discussion of Iris Murdoch and also hopefully introduce the next novelist in our series, which is Bessie Head, whose novel, A Question of Power, we will discuss. So, in the previous two lectures, I undertook a somewhat detailed deep dive into the work of this contemporary philosopher, Agnes Callard, as a way of shedding light on what seems to me a very strong, a very obviously noticeable feature in Iris Murdoch's fiction, which is the openness and the willingness to treat in a fictional way and to write fiction as if to undertake philosophy by other means, and particularly philosophy as it pertained to the meaning of identity and the relationship between people. Now, in this lecture, I want to try and understand that in more detail and to try and be more specific about what kinds of philosophies inspired such treatment in Iris Murdoch's fiction, what implications that had for Murdoch as a writer of fiction, and how are we to make sense of it today after all these years. I'll rely somewhat in this description on the work of the scholar Colin Burrow, who has recently written an essay and from which I quoted in the previous lecture, the essay on Iris Murdoch. And it is Colin Burrow who reflects on the word parody and coins an adjective out of this verb, parody. And the adjective, which is a word that I quoted in the previous lecture, is parodyability. And the reason why Burrow coins this phrase is because so many contemporary writers and so many influential 20th century British writers parodied Iris Murdoch's fictional style, and specifically this very novel, A Severed Head, published 1961. Now, Burrow undertakes a somewhat detailed reading of almost the entirety of Murdoch's oeuvre, which, by the way, is another reason why many commentators and scholars have tended to dismiss Murdoch. They have tended to say things like Murdoch wrote too much and therefore spread herself too thin. Burrow takes that claim seriously, but proceeds with a healthy mix of both skepticism as well as the openness to being influenced and the openness to being enchanted and inspired. So, the first thing to note about Murdoch's fictional oeuvre, and this is something that even readers of A Severed Head will easily notice, is that Murdoch's fiction combines at least two formulaic styles of fiction writing. The first is detective fiction, and the second is a comedy of manners. Now, both of these forms of writing have very rich and deep literary histories within the literary cultures of England. Detective fiction had been a very popular genre, and it was popular even among other Oxford dons, other contemporary professionals, individuals with whom Iris Murdoch had a lot more in common, professionally speaking, colleagues of Iris Murdoch. A lot of philosophy professors at Oxford wrote fiction, detective fiction, under pseudonyms. And this is something that can be seen even today. Those of you who follow contemporary publishing know that J.K. Rowling has been publishing under the pseudonym. Well, it's no longer a pseudonym now, but enjoyed a great deal of success as Robert Galbraith. Another contemporary writer, the Irish novelist John Banville, has been publishing detective fiction, not under a pseudonym, not secretively, so Banville is not hiding, but almost as a parallel career. Banville's novels have a very serious philosophical and high aesthetic quality. Banville is among those few novelists who've been shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, I think 2 or 3 times already. So Banville had a reputation of being this very serious, high-minded, aesthetic writer. And at some point, I think in the early 21st century, Banwell began to write detective fiction for fun. And it became a series. The same two characters appear, they find a different, mysterious murder, crime, and they begin to repeat what they do very well, which is talk to people, decode, and basically play detective. This can also be seen in the genre of cozy crime, which is taking the world by storm today, and it's more popular in the realm of audio visual media, in electronic media, in films and TV shows. But one can very easily trace its origin back to the work of Agatha Christie, say. So, detective fiction has always been this very, very popular form. It's also been a form that rewards exertion and efforts by writers who are otherwise engaged in less escapist or less popular forms of intellectual work, which is to say, philosophy professors. Philosophy professors have found that they can derive a great deal of pleasure for themselves, but also provide pleasure that is right, good, engaging, interesting novels. If they direct their philosophical training, their ability to think, their ability to write, not towards simply teaching philosophy, but towards writing detective novels. And there were contemporaries of Iris Murdoch who were writing detective fiction. So this is something that very clearly influenced and shaped Murdoch's writerly career. Another thing which is very important to note is that the comedy of manners, in which privileged middle to upper middle class to upper class individuals went about creating problematic relationships and solving them over the course of a novel or a play or film. This also was a very popular genre and influenced Murdoch's writing. If one sees Murdoch's oeuvre as a whole, one can find that these two genres become sort of like templates for Murdoch's fiction. It's as if Murdoch takes these two genres as outlines or blank slates and proceeds to fill them with content that is drawn from real life, but it is examined with the lenses or the ideas of philosophy. And in some ways, this is what makes Murdoch's fiction very powerful and compelling. But this is also what makes a lot of Murdoch's fiction somewhat repetitive, somewhat mundane, and why Murdoch remains today in that middling category of very respected 20th century British fiction, but not quite at the level of, say, Virginia Woolf or other contemporary writers like Zadie Smith or Jeanette Winterson. It's the quality of being a bit too repetitive and sometimes a bit too experimental and formulaic in quite very different sense from the way romance novels or detective fiction could be said to be formulaic. Now, the formulaic nature of Iris Murdoch's fiction consists in this. Murdoch takes a Platonic or Socratic idea of humanity, actually, and specifically many aspects of human existence. Platonic definitions of love, for instance, Platonic definitions of aesthetics, Platonic definitions of power, and most obviously the Platonic theory of forms. Now, these ideas themselves are very complex, so I will not try to explain them fully, but to provide a very, very basic working summary, these ideas mean that essentially things like love, power, forms, they are all eternal and they have very little to do with how individual human beings live. So things like how a particular person's voice sounds, for instance, how a particular person holds a pen, for instance. So these individual traits or traits which individualize, particularly speaking, a human being. These traits are less important in the Platonic Socratic school of thought. What's more important is how these individual traits, and I've just taken a couple of examples, but they can be anything, individual traits reflective of and are functions of eternal, unchanging, universal, and abstract forces. Like I said, this is not to be taken as a serious expert philosophical definition. It is a summary. Now, if the fictional world or that Iris Murdoch's novels create, if they were to merely repeat this abstract philosophical idea, then the fiction would become quite boring. It would become like a summary of philosophy through fiction. And at best, it could serve an educational purpose, like a textbook written for middle school students. But thankfully, and the reason why Murdoch had such a successful career and is still very, very widely respected, even if, as I mentioned earlier, not considered a truly great novelist, is that Murdoch's fiction contains quite a diverse range of treatments of these ideas. And to describe that range, I'll use two examples. The first is a novel that I have chosen for analysis, which is A Severed Head, published in 1961. I'll contrast this with another novel, which I think in some ways is a more well-known novel, which is titled The Sea, the Sea. The phrase "the sea" is repeated twice with a comma between them. It was published in the year 1978, if I'm not mistaken, and it won the Booker Prize. It is, by all means, the most well-known novel that Iris Murdoch ever wrote. And in some ways, for many, it is also her best work. I was tempted to include that in this course instead of A Severed Head, but the reason I didn't is because it's a very popular novel, so perceptions of popular texts are often already too fixed, and therefore it's difficult to get beyond them. But the other reason also is that the Sea is also a very big novel. It contains too many pages. Overwritten, according to many scholars. I wouldn't call it overwritten, but it's definitely a more demanding text than A Severed Head. But also, A Severed Head is not that well known, and it helps readers get a very particular situated sense of what it must have felt like to witness the beginning of this writer's career. So that's what A Severed Head brings to our table. Now, A Severed Head may be said to be a work in which Iris Murdoch has not quite found her footing as a novelist and is still experimenting with the exact manner in which philosophy and fiction can live together. And I say that because the treatment of love or attraction between human beings, or the meaning and the value of romantic attraction, those treatments in A Severed Head seem to be an allegory of the Socratic ideas of eros that one finds in a lot of philosophy texts, and especially in Plato's dialogue, The Symposium. And the title of the novel, A Severed Head, also has to do with the detachment, the divorce between the spiritual and the bodily. And this dichotomy is developed most powerfully in the dialogue Phaedrus, another Socratic dialogue. And essentially the story in Phaedrus is that humanity, or all human beings, are governed by two contradictory impulses. I think in some readings it's the Apollonian versus the Dionysian, but essentially the two impulses have to do with one which is motivated by spiritual, intellectual concerns, and the other motivated by bodily and more carnal concerns. And again, I'm speaking in very general and vague, summarizing terms. This is not a philosophy course, so the treatment of philosophy will be in a very general sense. The moral of Phaedrus is that human beings will always be in a state of flux. They will be torn between these two impulses, and the image that Plato gives is that of a chariot being driven by two sets of horses, both pulling the chariot in different directions. And the goal or the aim of the driver of that chariot is to somehow reconcile these opposing forces and to harmonize them so that they pull in one direction instead of opposing each other. And in ethical terms, the advice of Idris is that human beings have to reconcile these divergent impulses. The lesson seems to be replicated in its failure in A Severed Head, because the characters in this novel seem to take that awareness, the awareness that all human beings are being pulled in opposing directions by concerns of the spirit and by concerns of the body. And so, one of the characters in this novel, A Severed Head, says that she would like to receive the heads of her lovers separated from their bodies. And it's a satirical comment about how cynical a certain group of privileged, educated, upper middle class English people have become. They have lost the ability to fully reconcile these divergent impulses. And their reaction to knowing that they have these divergent impulses is to indulge each of those bodily desires without consequence, or without thinking about the consequence of those indulgences. And so ultimately, the work remains a satirical look at the kind of confusion and conflicts that emerge when educated people decide to give in to each of these impulses. And to stay for a moment on A Severed Head, this sort of the idea of eros that emerges from A Severed Head is that individual human beings are actually not important. Human beings are replaceable, and it is the replaceability of human beings which is the most defining characteristic of humanity. And ultimately, it's a very philosophical, but ultimately a very pessimistic view of the possibilities of attraction and relationships between human beings. So, if individual human beings are replaceable, then it doesn't matter who or which person we choose to be with. And obviously, Iris Murdoch as a person doesn't quite believe in this idea literally. And the joke is, look what happens when people are stupid enough to believe this. Although philosophically, right, simply while understanding the thesis of a dialogue by Plato, or a conversation between Socrates and, say, Alcibiades, or any other colleague of his from the symposium, it may be easy to understand this idea. But in real life, these ideas cannot really go very far towards explaining life or giving people a way in which to organize their lives. The idea that emerges from A Severed Head is that human beings are replaceable. And more important than the particular features of any individual human beings is the essential replaceability of human beings. So, this is the idea that emerges from A Severed Head. Now, if we compare this to the other novel that I mentioned, which is The Sea, we find that the perspective that the narrator builds through the experiences of the protagonist, which is Charles Araby, the perspective that emerges is much more nuanced. In The Sea, Charles Araby begins with this sort of an idea that human beings are replaceable, and has a very cynical and pessimistic view of the meaning of attraction or eros or love, believing that ultimately there are no spiritual or religious or moral values that help govern human life, that essentially it is simply a kind of animalistic or carnal desire, and which translates into a very pessimistic idea of power. So, and by the way, just a side note, the idea of power as being central to relationships is also a consequence of this universal, abstract, replaceable idea of love that is repeatedly mentioned in A Severed Head. A Severed Head also has several mentions of marriage or monogamy or relationships as being functions of power. This is also questioned to a great deal in the later novel, that is, The Sea, the Sea. So, Charles Araby in the Sea begins with the very cynical, pessimistic idea that there is nothing spiritual or moral about relationships, that they are a very, very thinly veiled pursuit of power, of selfish personal gratification, and ultimately, all relationships therefore contain an undeniable degree of violence and even cruelty. This is the idea that Charles Araby begins with. But then something happens in the novel, which is that Charles Araby is almost killed. He's pushed into the sea and he has retired and he has moved to this very, very big house by the sea. An accident takes place in which he's pushed into the sea, almost drowns, and then is mysteriously pulled out of the water by someone who disappears as soon as he's pulled out. So the novel begins with this accident and turns into a sort of detective quest because the narrator, who is himself the victim of this mysterious attack, sets about trying to find out who is it that might have tried to kill him, and then also who is it that saved him. And it is in this process of trying to find out who did it, trying to answer this question that shapes every detective novel, that Charles Araby turns into a kind of philosopher, detective, but also in some ways a philosophical novelist. So, this is also why, for many readers, the Sea contains the most powerful articulation of the potential of realistic fiction when it is practiced by a very, very thoughtful, linguistically very fluent, and masterful storyteller like Iris Murdoch. What happens is Charles Araby begins to think about the people around him, and in the way that Charles Araby begins to think about the people around him, he reverses the abstracting view of life which Iris Murdoch's early fiction tends to contain. So, the abstracting view of life is basically this idea that what makes us unique as individuals is less important than what makes us identifiable as human in the general sense of the word. So, in A Severed Head, the narrator seems to focus on what makes all of these bumbling characters human. Their inability to be clear, their inability to focus, their tendency to want to replace one lover or spouse or friend with another. This confusion comes from a philosophical or an academic, but ultimately incomplete awareness of the essential humanness of all individuals. Now, in the Sea, once Charles Araby tries to find out who might have had the motivations to kill him and who might have saved him simply by the necessity of the situation, simply by the pressure to find out who it was that might have done this, Charles Araby turns into less philosophical, less academic, more journalistic, a more observant type of observer. And what he observes is that people have traits, people have characteristics, people have idiosyncrasies, people have very unique mannerisms. So, for instance, people move their hands and their faces in very unique ways when they do the most commonplace things. So, for instance, people have ways of holding their pens, which I mentioned earlier. People have ways of holding things like spoons and forks when they eat. People have ways of moving their hands while they eat. People have ways of arranging their bodies, their postures, when they sit, when they stand, when they meet people, when they interact with others. And those of you who are watching my lectures know that I certainly have mannerisms. I have ways of moving my face and my neck and when I give these lectures. So these are all traits, these are all characteristics that make me, like everyone else, a human being in mine and in their own right. The protagonist of the Sea, realizes that it is necessary, it is at least as important, if not more important, to focus on these individualizing traits and as much as to focus on the universal qualities of being human. And it is this ability to include this range, to have novels in which the philosophical awareness of humanity is not just repeated, but actually questioned. It is this range which I think justifies Iris Murdoch's place in any canon of 20th century fiction. I'll continue this discussion, wrap it up, and move on to the next novelist in the next lecture. Thanks.